Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis here, and this week's lesson is going to be on European colonization of the New World. The first part of this is going to discuss New Spain, and the second part of this will discuss the development of some of England's colonies, particularly the Jamestown colony. So, imaged here on this map, you see in shaded areas on the top map, of course, you see the South American colonies of the Spanish Empire, which are established after Columbus's sail in 1492. And then, of course, the lower map shows you the northern Spanish territories that stretched from the areas of Central America and Mexico, and even parts of what are today the United States, and of course the Caribbean. So, the Spanish Empire was established formally after the arrival of Columbus in 1492, and during the 16th century, Spain really was the dominant imperial power in the New World. Of course, the Portuguese were a legitimate power as well, and the Portuguese had begun the colonization of what we consider Brazil, ultimately. But Spain is really the dominant New World power. The king of Spain was Charles V, and he was the great Holy Roman Emperor. And in Europe, he controlled areas in Italy, he controlled areas in Germany and Central Europe, he controlled the Low Countries, Netherlands and Belgium, and of course Spain. He was a very powerful king, and following the arrival of Columbus in the Caribbean, the Spanish sent explorers to the New World and extended out the influence of Spanish domains in the Americas. And some of these, many of the next wave of explorer after Columbus were in fact not sanctioned directly by the crown. You know, of course, Columbus was sanctioned by the crown, Ferdinand and Isabella, but many of the conquistadors who followed afterwards were actually privateers. Hernan Cortes, Francisco Pizarro, who conquered the Inca in South America, were actually privateers initially. But during the 16th century, the Spanish crown will effectively end any private development and will assume a kind of royal organization over the new territories in both Central America and South America. And all proceeds that came out of the America, a fifth, would go to the crown, referred to as a royal fifth, effectively the monarchy's taxation. The Spanish, led by explorers like De Soto and Coronado, actually explored significantly into what becomes the United States. And you can see their routes here with De Soto exploring into the areas of Florida and the southern Gulf states area, discovering, if you will, the Mississippi River. And Coronado extending his explorations into areas of Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, and New Mexico. And these were very, very extensive explorations, and both of these explorers were looking for another great Indian kingdom after the conquest of the Inca Empire and the conquest of the Aztec Empire. Many European explorers went to great lengths to try and find what was believed to be this other mythical Native American kingdom that they hoped to plunder in a similar fashion. This is a look at the fort in St. Augustine, Florida, and this was established by Don Pedro Mendez de Alba in 1565, and it is the oldest permanent settlement, Spanish settlement in North America, and really the most northern, legitimate or strong Spanish base on continental North America as well, in Florida. And this is actually significant because the colony of Jamestown will in part be established out of a desire of English to pirate and plunder Spanish shipping. Many of the great early English maritime captains, like for example Sir Francis Drake, were known by the Spanish for their piracy. And Sir Francis Drake, the famous um, uh, seafarer for Queen Elizabeth during the late 16th century was known by the Spanish as the Dragon, because he was a pirate. And so the outposts, first at Roanoke Island and then at Jamestown, were actually designed to, in part, I mean, there's a number of reasons, but one reason was to keep an eye on the Spanish and to potentially plunder Spanish galleons coming up out of the Caribbean. New Spain, which is what we refer to now, there were actually a number of different principalities that were established in the New World. There was New Granada, there's New Spain. Um, so, um, so I'm referring to New Spain generally, even though there are the Spanish Empire in the New World is broken up into a number of different governing districts. So we're just going to use New Spain as kind of a way of referring to the whole thing, because it stretches literally, ultimately, from areas of South America all the way up into areas of the Caribbean and Mexico and even the American Southwest. The first area colonized by the Spanish was the island of Hispaniola. And of course, you will remember from the De las Casas reading, the primary source that we read from the missionary, Bartholomew de las Casas, that is where he was writing from. And eventually, they will colonize the islands of Cuba, Barbados, and they'll go down into South America and Peru, and of course also in Mexico. During the early phase of the Spanish imperial system, they used something called the encomienda system, which was basically a system in which the Spanish were supposed to act as overseers and organizers of native labor, but it amounts to really nothing more than native slave labor. And of course, you saw that. You read that in the De las Casas letter, and you saw just how brutal this system was on Native Americans. Later, the encomienda system will be replaced by the repartimiento, which was designed to be a moderated reform of how Spaniards were using the labor of Native Americans. And it replaced the encomienda system, which was basically a slave labor system, but it was still nonetheless abusive in many ways. The primary industries of New Spain were industries like gold mining, and silver, of course, will become the primary source. There's a lot of gold mining, particularly in places like Mexico, but silver will become the most really prized commodity of New Spain, particularly the silver mines in Bolivia, Potosi, which is ultimately the most impressive of the silver mines throughout the domains of New Spain. Potosi is a huge silver mine in Bolivia, and it's still mined to this day. And Potosi single-handedly really created the first global economic currency exchange. And this was, for the first time, so much silver came out of Potosi that for the first time, the world economic system seemed to run on almost a singular currency. And that singular currency was Spanish silver, but particularly silver from Potosi. And, I mean, of course, there were other economies in place, but Spanish silver from Potosi was traded throughout the world, from China to Europe and so forth. And, of course, the mining of Potosi was particularly harsh on native people, similar to what you read in De las Casas. The mining of the Potosi mine resulted in really huge amounts of tragic deaths of native peoples. Peoples, for example, suffered from mercury poisoning, cave-ins. It was an incredibly dangerous type of work, and of course the natives were generally overworked. Ultimately, sugar becomes, in many parts of the New World, South America and the Caribbean, sugar became a primary cash crop. And this was particularly the case in Portuguese Brazil and also on Spanish Caribbean islands. The sugar system, the sugar manufacturing system, was a very, very demanding system. It was a process that required a lot of labor, and of course also in a very, very hot and intense climate. And the sugar plantations demanded a widespread use ultimately of African slave labor. Um, and so it was a very harsh form of labor. Like literally, like average lifespan was 3 years for people who worked in these as slaves in these plantations. And so the sugar plantations, more than any other form of slavery in the New World, the sugar plantations of the Caribbean and of South America required an exponential increase in slaves from Africa. And so as we look at the establishment of the Atlantic slave system, sugar really makes up the bulk of where African slaves are taken to. And of course, it is an intensely brutal regime and is playing in very fundamentally into a change in slavery. Slavery had been around for a long, long time in the world, a long time. And slavery had been practiced, of course, in the Roman Empire. It had been practiced in, the Middle Eastern world and Africa for a long, long period of time. However, this slave industry of the Atlantic trade, the Atlantic system of the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s, and so on, was different in the sense that for the first time we see a racialization of slavery, in which a particular so-called racial group of people were preyed upon and associated with slavery, and effectively were relegated to, in the minds of Europeans, to the status of a lower racial grouping. So as you see an exponential growth of the slave trade, increasingly you will see, developing alongside of this slave trade, you will see slowly the development of really a racialization of the slave system. And that, of course, has massive consequences for the world then and now, of course. In New Spain, conversion of native peoples to Christianity was integral, and we see this in a lot of areas of New Spain. In in areas in which were populated by the Mayan people. Now, the Mayan, in terms of the great, huge monument-building society the Mayans had, passed from existence, but the Mayan people still lived and still existed in areas around the Yucatan, and the Spanish went to great lengths to destroy the written artifacts of those people, to destroy their religion and their culture, because they deemed it to be a kind of devilry. A similar story plays out in Peru, as the Spaniards saw Peruvian religion with its ancient practice of mummification, and they went to great lengths to destroy this. And thousands of sacred Peruvian mummies were destroyed by the Spanish, as the Spanish will intensely focus on converting the New World to Christianity. And of course, many Native Americans, some resist conversion, others convert, and still others kind of halfway convert and use a conversion as a way to edge out a certain degree of agency for themselves within this kind of challenging middle ground between which they are in an interaction with Europeans and a new religion, and trying to hold on to their old ways while simultaneously trying to survive and thrive. The ramifications, of course, of these interactions, too, is a mass population loss from disease and overwork and so forth. The island of Hispaniola, which is where Dominican Republic and Haiti are, and that's where De las Casas was, sees a drop in the population from roughly 70,000 to 17,000 in less than a century. And this was obviously massively devastating to native peoples and to their cultures. And it also factored into a movement towards increasing amounts of African slavery. And again, the racialization of the slave process really is beginning in earnest at this time. In the New World, there's also the development of a new kind of hierarchy in terms of the leadership and government of New World domains. There are groups in the New World, the leadership group were called peninsulares, and these were individuals that were Spanish born. They're the minority in the country. These are people who literally were born in Spain and have come across. The next leadership rung, this is it's a class hierarchy, and it's a class hierarchy based effectively on what your ethnic or racial identity is. And so the second hierarchy in the leadership class were the Creoles. And the Creoles were those of Spanish heritage. And this similar, by the way, this similar kind of model fits for Portuguese Brazil as well. These individuals are of Spanish heritage, but they were born in the New World. And so they were like the second rung of this new leadership hierarchy. They were well off, they owned lands, they owned slave plantations, but they were born in the New World. And these individuals are the ones who will lead the revolutions of independence in the early 1800s. And these are individuals like Simón Bolívar, if any of you guys have perhaps known the name of the great Venezuelan revolutionary figure in the early 1800s. And then, of course, we have mestizo, and the mestizos are those of native and Spanish descendancy. And they were the next rung on the power hierarchy. And the final rung in the power hierarchy was the Zambo, which was a native and an African. And they had even less power. And then, of course, the African slaves at the very bottom. So there's really a racial hierarchy, ultimately, that develops in New Spain based on a person's, considered to be a person's basic ethnic identity. And so this is how government leadership, power, money, opportunity, this is how it was determined. It was effectively a New World caste system, if you will. The colonization of North America begins first in the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake is what we refer to as Virginia, North Carolina, and parts of Maryland. But really Virginia and Maryland, North Carolina only loosely. Well, really North Carolina is not really part of the Chesapeake, practically speaking, but in a way I suppose it is. But Virginia and Maryland are what we typically call the Chesapeake. And the beginning of English colonization in the New World begins first with the expedition that was organized by Sir Walter Raleigh, who is depicted here. Sir Walter Raleigh organized the initial voyage to Roanoke Island, though he did not make the trip because Queen Elizabeth, who he is very close to, did not want him to go, because of course these types of ventures were highly dangerous, and oftentimes individuals didn't come back. The English explorer John Cabot, for example, had made more than one adventure at the end of the 15th century to areas around Newfoundland, and of course he didn't come back after his second voyage. And so that was always a possibility at this early age of the Atlantic crossing. The Roanoke Island colony became referred to as the Lost Colony because the Roanoke Island colony was established in 1585. It was on an island off the coast of North Carolina, as you see pictured on the map. But what had happened is that after the Roanoke colony was established and the supply ships basically left, it took time before they came back because England and Spain fell into an increasingly intensified conflict. One that England will ultimately come out in the better. The Spanish Armada in 1588 was defeated handedly, and much of their destruction was actually at the hands of Mother Nature, as a huge storm on the northern coast of Great Britain dashed much of the Spanish Armada. But because of that conflict, they weren't able to resupply the colony until 1590. And when the second trip made it back in 1590, they found no one. And all they found was an engraving on a tree that had the engraving of the word Croatan. And we have no idea what that word means. And this is why it's a mystery. It's the lost colony. And we can only assume what happened to these people. Perhaps they were adopted into native tribes. It's difficult to know. Jamestown, depicted here, became the first permanent English colony. And of course this was established when the Discovery, the Godspeed, and the Susan Constant, captained by individuals like Christopher Newport, individuals like John Smith, sailed to the area of what we call the Chesapeake. And the Chesapeake refers to really the areas around the Chesapeake Bay, Virginia and Maryland. And Jamestown, of course, who's named for King James I, was established and founded by the Virginia Company. And the Virginia Company, this is the Virginia Company seal that you see here. The Virginia Company was what we call a joint stock company. It was like what will later be called the English East India Company, or the Dutch East India Company. These are joint stock companies, and by that they are what we consider really an early kind of corporation. They are a group of investors who are all going in on a project. The Virginia Company, which oversaw this colonization from the perspective of the king, King James, they didn't do a very good job of it. And because the colony was effectively unsustainable, King James will, by 1624, take measures to make Jamestown a royal colony, and he will effectively revoke the charter that he gave Virginia Company to establish this colony. So the Virginia Company controlled Jamestown from 1607 to 1624. And the Virginia Company was very significant in the long-term development of representative governments and private banking and investment systems, which were very fundamental to the establishment of the modern industrializing world. The Virginia Company was a joint stock company. It's basically an early corporation. The Virginia Company was chartered by King James I to go to the area of Virginia, the Chesapeake, and establish a colony. It was a group of wealthy investors, basically. The reason it's like a corporation is because you would have a group of investors who would go in on funding the venture, maybe paying 10% each, which would give you a larger chance for profit, but it would limit your losses if the venture did not turn out well. And of course, these ventures could be very, very risky, and so it was all in the best interest that you were able to cushion your losses. The Virginia Company were doing what was very, very kind of in vogue at the time. They were looking for what's called the Northwest Passage. And this was something that explorers had theorized for quite some time. They believed that there had to be a northern passage through North America that passed through to Asia or the Pacific and gave you access to Asia. And so there had really been an underestimation of just how big the Americas was. And so many explorers, the Virginia Company included, had pursued exploration out of interest of finding the Northwest Passage. Some theorized that the Chesapeake Bay leading up through the Potomac was a Northwest Passage. And the colonists, Christopher Newport, John Smith, people like this, explored the area thinking they might find a Northwest Passage. Henry Hudson, who gets his name, of course, we get the name the Hudson Bay from Henry Hudson, the Hudson River from Henry Hudson. Henry Hudson was an English explorer who was convinced there was a Northwest Passage, and he sailed for the Dutch East India Company when he explored what becomes known as the Hudson River, and he sailed all the way up to modern-day Albany. Eventually, Hudson actually died in what now is named Hudson Bay because his crew mutinied and left him and his son adrift on Hudson Bay while they went back home. And Hudson was convinced, when they did this, he was convinced that he had found the Pacific Ocean. So the Northwest Passage to the Pacific was a theory that never really works out. But this was one of the things that was motivating a lot of English exploration in this area. There were also, of course, still the stories that maybe there was another great native kingdom with riches that could be plundered. There were also motivations to pirate Spanish galleons and steal their wealth as they came up from the Caribbean, which of course led to very significant conflict with the Spanish and the English at the end of the 16th century. Ultimately, the New World, they had to find a way to make the New World profitable. When I say the New World, we're referring in this case to the area of the Chesapeake, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina. And what ultimately makes it profitable is the cultivation of a new cash crop, the cash crop of tobacco. Now, initially, the people who came, there were a lot of problems with Jamestown. Jamestown was an unsustainable colony. Many of the settlers who came first were not farmers. They didn't get there until late April, so they needed to farm, and not only was nobody a farmer, they weren't really interested in farming. Many people were there, and they were, like, for example, John Smith was a map maker, and he's making maps, and people are exploring to see if they can find the Northwest Passage. They're looking for a mythical native city. They were not paying attention to having to do the dirty work of farming. And a lot of that also had to do with the fact that many of the people who came considered themselves of the gentlemanly class in England. They were gentry, and this class of people did not work with their hands. They didn't farm. They didn't do labor. These were accountants and lawyers and people like this. And by their class, they didn't do hard labor, and in fact would in some cases refuse to do hard labor. And so the consequence of this is that you have terrible, terrible suffering in the colonies. 1609 and 1610 were referred to as the starving time, where the colony almost ceased to exist, and colonists resorted to cannibalism to survive. After the starving time, the remaining colonists tried to flee. They tried to sail their ships back to England, and they were met by Lord de la Warr, who was sent to get the colony in shape, and Count de la Warr actually stopped them and forced them to go back, much to the chagrin of many of those colonists. And de la Warr would then kind of work the colony into shape, and also encouraged warring on native factions in the area, which created some problems between natives and colonists. And Count de la Warr is where Delaware comes from, by the way. Jamestown was also plagued by disease. Does anybody know what kind of diseases plagued Jamestown? They were plagued by gastrointestinal illnesses like dysentery. And this had a lot to do with the fact that, Jamestown's located on a part of the James River that's slow flowing, and the drinking water was positioned in a place where it was positioned near downstream from where people went to the bathroom. And so many people became ill with illnesses that are born out of polluted water, polluting drinking water, like dysentery. Jamestown was, until the late 1620s, completely unsustainable. And this leads the King of England to make the colony a royal colony in 1624. At least it motivated him to do that. Early Jamestown was, a difficult place for a lot of reasons. There were very few women, and ultimately you will see efforts to bring women in in the later stages of or the middle stages of the 1600s. The native tribes there were referred to as Chief Powhatan's Confederation or Confederacy, and initially for about a decade there was relatively peaceful interactions with the colonists. And of course, John Rolfe and Pocahontas which is depicted in this painting here, had met, and Pocahontas would of course go to England. And there's of course the famous story about Pocahontas and John Smith, right? And John Smith, of course, who was to be killed by Chief Powhatan, and the myth is that Pocahontas stepped in and saved John Smith. Historians have looked at that story with great skepticism, and historians have suggested that likely what happened there was not a native princess having the better moral mind to save the civilized from the savage, but instead what was probably happening there is that Chief Powhatan his people were probably playing out an actual a ritual, an initiation ritual, in which Rolfe and Smith and Christopher Newport and the other colonists at Jamestown were effectively being told that, hey, we are willing to work with you, but you are a subservient tribe, and ultimately you will be subservient to Chief Powhatan in this area. So there is a fanciful, mythical story about, John Smith and Pocahontas, and it's been retold through American folklore ever since. But that story, which was written a decade after the fact, by the way, over a decade after the fact, that story we think was a story that was very laden with European overtones and is probably not true to what was really happening there. After Chief Powhatan dies, Opechancanough, who is the next chief in line, um, comes to the conclusion that it's either going to have to be us or them. He comes to the conclusion that the colonists will have to be eliminated if the native peoples are to continue their way of life. And so there's a war in 1622 that results in a devastating exchange in which Opechancanoug's people raid Jamestown, and the Jamestown settlers respond um, with crushing reprisals on the native peoples. And so it's at this point you really start to see the development of increasingly hostile relations, which will continue intermittently for the next 2 centuries. But particularly in this area for the next 50, 60, 70 years in the area of Virginia. John Rolfe, who is depicted here with Pocahontas in the very Europeanized and mythicized or legendary, I should say, painting. John Rolfe, of course, was noted for the commodification of tobacco. The colonies were not sustainable, and they found no great treasure, and they found no great passage to Northwest Passage, and so the lack of sustainability not only led King James to make it a royal colony in 1624, but also for tobacco to be promoted as a cash crop, a commodity that could be sold and made profitable. And so tobacco becomes the industry of the Americas, and it will be tobacco that will be primarily the source of eventually slave labor, first indentured labor, but it will be the source of profit and income for the majority of people who come to the New World during the 1600s and the 1700s. In this process, too, we have established the House of Burgesses, which is the local governing house of Virginia. And the Burgesses were very significant. The Burgesses was a representative house in which there was an upper house that was effectively appointed by a royally appointed governor, and then there was a lower house that represented the people of the colony. And of course, the significance for this long term is really learning how to do government. The United States has been very fortunate to create a very workable, flexible, governing system that we have still in place. And it was really experience of 150 years of self-government in places like the Chesapeake and in Massachusetts Bay that made this really possible. Population and labor. In Jamestown, in the Chesapeake, slavery was not the dominant form of labor really until the end of the 17th century. It was not the dominant form of labor in the 1600s. It doesn't begin to be so until really the very end of that century. Many people wanted to come to the New World. There was a great deal of overpopulation in England. There was a lack of jobs in England. And so this played into the usage of what we call indentured servitude. And indentured servitude was basically a form of labor payment. So when you wanted to come to the New World, you had to pay your way, and that meant paying a head right. And the head right got you 50 acres when you got into the New World. And what you want, if you're going at this time, is you want land so you can farm tobacco, and you can make a profit on this Atlantic commodity exchange. Well, a lot of people couldn't pay. And so if you couldn't pay, you would get a sponsor to pay for you. And in exchange for that, you would provide servant labor on a plantation for 4 to 8 years. And then after your years of servitude, you would gain freedom and you would be able to access land, as was your original purpose of coming. The real limitations and issues with this over the century are there's a limitation on the amount of land. Now, immediately you might say, well, wait a second, this is the New World and we're just on the very coastal areas, so isn't there lots of land? And the answer to that is yes and no, because there's a lot of land, but the land to the west is all controlled by native tribes. And as the Jamestown colony started to develop a functioning economy in the middle 1600s, it became in the interest of the crown and in the interest of the status quo leadership, the upper class leadership in the colonies, the large landowners, to prevent any kinds of conflicts with Native Americans, because conflicts with Native Americans were costly. They were violent, they were destructive, and they cost a lot of money. And so many of the leaders in the House of Burgesses and the Crown sought to limit Western migration, and they sought to limit an expansion into Western lands in Virginia for the purpose of farming, because they wanted to prevent violence with Native Americans in the mid-1650s and 1660s. And this made it more and more difficult for indentured servants who would become freedmen to get land. And so there was a problem in the 1660s and 1670s in which you had a lot of non-land owning freemen who demanded that Native American land be opened up for farming. And that leads to a rebellion known as Bacon's Rebellion. And ultimately, Bacon's Rebellion plays a fundamental role in ultimately the shifting of the labor in the colonies from indentured servitude to slavery. Bacon's Rebellion happened in 1676, and it was effectively an uprising of former indentured servants, small landowners, and landless freemen who wanted land. They armed themselves and they burned Jamestown, and they waged a rebellion against Governor Berkeley and the House of Burgesses that ran the Jamestown colony at the time. And that violence from the labor source effectively led the ruling status quo afterwards to move away from indentured servitude and instead to move towards the usage of African slave labor, because of the desire to that slavery can give you a greater ability to keep your labor uneducated, unarmed, and unable to resist you. And so it's not until the latter 1600s where you see the transition to slave labor. And there was, during the period of indentured servitude, there was a constant tension between labor and master, as the indentured servant was constantly trying to get their freedom and get their land, and the master was continually trying to extend their service. If you were a female servant and you were impregnated, in some cases you might even be impregnated by the master, that could extend your service for up to 2 years for being pregnant. If you were deemed to be not working hard, it could extend your tenure. And so there was this continual tension between the two. And so after Bacon's Rebellion, you really see a rather eager movement away from indentured servitude in the colonies and towards African slave labor on the tobacco fields of the Chesapeake.